I'm here with Penn King, co-founder of Bonding Health, and he's also a partner in Innovating Capital. And so he's here today to talk about his personal journey from ADHD child to ADHD app, and to talk about how ADHD in some ways has been highly correlated with entrepreneurship. And is it possible that some of the things that we call the symptoms of ADHD may actually map onto the skill set required of an entrepreneur? So we're here to explore that today. So welcome, Penn.
Thank you so much for having me, Laura. I'm very excited to chat.
Yeah, so there has been a lot of recent research around entrepreneurship and ADHD, and why does it seem like it attracts so many people that have ADHD? And the simplest thing is it obviously takes a lot of energy, and so what used to be hyperactivity is now massive action. But why don't you tell us a little bit about how your personal experiences with childhood ADHD led you and inspired you to create Bonding Health, an app for parents of children with ADHD?
It's a great question. I'd say a lot of my childhood stemmed around ADHD and medication.
Mm-hmm.
And I always felt like there were other options. And a lot of those options have been, and at the time were neglected by a lot of specialists. And I think being someone who had a lot of curiosity
Mm-hmm.
and excitement, I think that meshed well with wanting to do my own thing, seeing things that some people didn't see, for better or worse.
Mm-hmm.
And in this particular situation, when I looked at ADHD, I was fairly surprised. And at first, this was as an investor. I was
Mm-hmm.
fairly surprised by what I saw. And most of it was online pharmacies. And
Mm-hmm.
a lot of it was access to therapy, but the therapy itself wasn't different.
Mm-hmm.
So the actual interventions themselves were the same, right? CBT or other clinical solutions that had been around for decades. So really honing in on the child and what the child looks, who the child looks to, and what the child looks at is really
Mm-hmm.
the tendencies of the parent. So from that standpoint, I think it obviously evolved getting, you involved in the business. But overall, I'd say that, a lot of my past and my history has so much to do with me wanting to be an entrepreneur and so much
Mm-hmm.
to do with the identity of the company and wanting to go for it and wanting to actually take the step into entrepreneurship, especially when, I had a business in the, investment world. So that was
Mm-hmm.
definitely something that was challenging to kind of step out of this investor role into kind of a balance between investing and entrepreneurship and operating a business. But
Mm-hmm.
funny enough, there's been a bit of a connection, and I'd say from an investment thesis perspective, it actually has been very helpful to be deep in the weeds and to see things that someone as an investor may not see. So
Mm-hmm.
getting that operational background, as well as kind of looking at things from an investor standpoint, has actually been fairly synergistic. So it's been cool to travel down those two paths simultaneously.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And do you think that there are some aspects of ADHD, or which particular symptoms of ADHD do you think have translated into success as an entrepreneur? That there's some upside to the very symptoms that we're talking about, and as you were talking, and I'm thinking about, our work in Bonding Health. And I think, of course, multitasking is not a good thing. It's not necessarily good for your brain. But if you think about it, every day we're doing like three different things that are not necessarily related to each other, from creating content to marketing to creating pitches and trying to bring on other people's guidance, and so many different hats to wear. but what other ways do you see ADHD as actually being part of the job description of an entrepreneur?
Mm. I'd say a lot of the hyperactivity,
Mm-hmm.
because that allows you to just be tenacious, extremely tenacious, and fairly relentless.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really easy to kind of give up if you don't have, that kind of enormous amount of kind of energy constantly. And I'd say that repeats itself. So
Mm-hmm.
you might have a day of defeat, but then the
Mm-hmm.
next day you have this enormous amount of energy again,
Mm-hmm.
and you're tackling the same issue. And a lot of it's really repetitive. And I'd say that is that works well with ADHD.
Mm-hmm.
I'd say the challenge is evolving yourself and, continuing to execute. But if you're able to kind of work through that and work through being consistent and executing, it's I could, it is a very successful method. And
Mm-hmm.
a lot of this, a lot in our business, right, in venture capital or in healthcare, it's a lot of cold calling. It's a lot of reaching out to people who most likely don't really want to hear from you. And you're trying to be creative. You're trying to solve this puzzle. And I'd say with ADHD, there's a true passion around that, which I think is another thing. So hyperactivity, but also real passion. And there is that curiosity, right? And there is that obsession. And I think that obsession, allows you to go above and beyond and to be continuous.
Mm-hmm.
And at some point, even if it doesn't work, you believe it will, which I think is
Mm-hmm.
another thing. Is it's like you do have this belief, which sometimes is unrealistic. It can,
Mm-hmm.
oftentimes it's very unrealistic. But by believing in yourself and having this belief, there is this element of visualization. There is this.
Mm-hmm.
I'd say that a lot of ADHD folks are dreamers, right? You have this,
Exactly.
you visualize this, and you manifest. And
Mm-hmm.
in some ways, you do manifest it. And I'd
Mm-hmm.
say that I've started to believe in that more.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the stories I've heard, like even like Novak Djokovic, his trainer, um, Helena Doncic, I think I'm pronouncing that probably wrong, but
Mm-hmm.
she would have him visualize him winning Grand Slams. She would have him
Mm-hmm.
visualize all of these things. And I don't know if he has ADHD or not, but a lot of ADHD people kind of become obsessed, and I think they have I think there is an element of like overconfidence or overexcitement.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess there are differences with overexcitement and overconfidence, but there are
Mm-hmm.
some similarities to it as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I'd say though, like those are probably the elements to me that kind of can become huge advantages
Mm-hmm.
if you kind of put them together the right way, mesh with some other skill sets that you need to kind of work on.
Mm-hmm. As you were talking, it was so funny because one of the symptoms of ADHD, of course, for children is talks too much. And, there's teachers say, and one of the tools that sometimes parents or teachers or coaches will use with an ADHD child is to say, okay, you just get one question, because sometimes an ADHD a kid will ask, 5 more questions and taking up the class time or making the coach so that they can't, hear what everyone else is having to say or to give their coaching. And when you talk about, having to face rejection, having to call people that might not want to hear you, but being able to keep making those calls, even with rejection, it's like talks too much. You love to talk. You have a lot to say. You can keep talking. You can keep going, even with rejection. So it's one of those things that, that idea of, of course, for the classroom, and if you're a coach or a parent, we're limiting our children. Do you just get one question during, the coaching, because everybody else has to have a chance, and we also have work to do. But there's many settings where keep talking even in the face of rejection when people are saying stop talking or I don't want to hear you. To keep talking as an entrepreneur is quite a advantage, actually.
I agree. I think balance is also really, really important. And obviously, now there's becoming a priority around mental health alongside performance, which historically for so long it has been just performance. So from that standpoint as well, I think, that in terms of talking too much, it's a huge advantage. But if you elevate to this point of incorporating balance around stillness and talking too much, that's really where it gets really exciting. And I incorporate, yoga and and meditation and exercise. And those three combined approaches with talking too much is really, really successful because you have that exuberance, but then you're able to kind of centralize it too and recognize when, the stillness, when you want that stillness. And that kind of can help with some consistency. So you're not manic all the time. And, you can hone in on when the right times are to kind of really go full throttle and then try to, and then try to kind of turn it off. And it's kind of going in between that balance, I think, is where you find people who have ADHD who have kind of conquered the mental health kind of angle of it. It has a lot to do with entrepreneurship as well. You don't want to burn yourself out. You don't want to, have this crazy amount of energy and then lose it and then have it and then lose it. You kind of want things to be more constant and more consistent and stable. Not to get sidetracked, but talking too much is, yes, absolutely. That is a great quality. And if you kind of evolve that to this kind of interesting balance between stillness and talking too much, it actually, I think it can create like strong, sustainable positive energy versus this very volatile kind of, very volatile kind of behavior that you kind of we struggle with as ADHD folks.
Okay, I'm going to throw a curveball at you as you're talking about sustainability. Because another major symptom of ADHD for both children and adults is, of course, forgetfulness. And so as you talk about, consistent rejection, as you're, on that path of, trying to, engage other people and to get funding, there has been this kind of a saying that ADHD people, at least they don't hold grudges because they just kind of forget about them. And I think that may also apply to business in the business setting, that you don't get discouraged because you're not ruminating about past, that conversation you had last week or 2 weeks ago, because you're just like, okay, what's next? And that kind of massive action, you're looking forward, you're ready to take more action, and you're kind of forgetting about those previous things that didn't work out. And so it's kind of another twist on this idea that forgetfulness, of course, is not helpful when you're a student and you've got an amazing amount of, content to learn and you have to, know it for the test. Of course, in those settings, being forgetful is going to, be a disadvantage. But do you have that sense that capacity to just move forward and forget about things that didn't work out? Could that also be an advantage for entrepreneurs?
Absolutely. I think, obviously you're a clinical psychologist, right? And I think I am a very spiritual person. And I think there is this element, right, of everything happens for a reason. And it is so much about your mindset and so much about creating, just visualizing positivity and keeping a positive mind and having empathy and trying to see, other people's perspective and trying to see things in a positive light. So 100,000%. I couldn't agree more with that statement or, that question. The answer being 100%, today is a new day, right? And when you wake up, tomorrow is a new day. There's a lot to be thankful for. I now incorporate, and I think it's really important for ADHD individuals to incorporate, a really strong morning routine.
Mm-hmm.
I try to, have affirmations. I try to write down affirmations. I try to visualize what my day is going to look like or what the future is going to look like. I exercise. I journal. So all of these things. And I'd say that so much of that is really stepping into the positive and letting go of the negative. My affirmation is not going to say, oh, today sucked, right? Or it's not going to be, yesterday sucked, So absolutely. And I think you are right. And I don't know the science behind it neurologically.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a neuroscientist, but absolutely there is something, I think, in the ADHD brain. And yeah, maybe it is a bit forgetful, but I think I think it could be even deeper than that, where there is this element of just being able to let go more
Mm-hmm.
and be
Mm-hmm.
able to let go of negative situations or
Mm-hmm.
circumstances. And maybe that's just a placebo, because that's helping me now be like, okay, maybe I can let go of things a little bit easier. But I do agree with you. I think that is, I guess that is a benefit if you're able to forget. I haven't really thought about that, to be honest. To be totally honest with you, I haven't analyzed forgetfulness being something that is a positive, and that's an interesting perspective. And I think there is a sign that if ADHD individuals are forgetful around negative things and less forgetful around positive things, that's absolutely great.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm going to continue the curveball with this idea that, so the idea, we think about forgetfulness you talk about your spiritual practice and mindfulness. So mindfulness is about being in the present, not being in the past and not being in the future. And so when you think about ADHD, it's like you're forgetful, you're forgetting your past, and you're not planning for the future. I mean, those, ADHD people, they're not planning. And so I do wonder that if that, in terms of the spirituality of mindfulness and Buddhism in general, and when you also think about being forgetful, there's a term in Buddhism which is called anatman, and it means there's no self in the sense of a permanent, integral, autonomous being with an individual experience. And whether you believe that or not, the idea is you're forgetting yourself. And if you think about it, then forgetting yourself really connects with all the other kind of spiritual approaches, which are attention to the world, care for other people. And so there's this kind of combination of forgetfulness with forgetting the past, forgetting the future, being present in the now, but also forgetting the self and, being really concerned and caring for other people. And I see that you've translated your personal childhood experience and adult experience with ADHD into helping other people. So I do wonder, this idea of forgetfulness, which we think is such a, debilitating symptom, and I'm not minimizing that. But as you talk about your spiritual journey, there does seem to be some kind of overlap.
Absolutely. There are definitely times where family members bring up certain situations and I don't remember them. So maybe that is, and I would say it's probably a combination of positive experiences and negative experiences. So I would certainly say that probably has a lot to do with it in, in this ability to hone in on positive events more than negative ones. I don't know. But that's interesting. That's an interesting wormhole to look into more. I have not looked at that at all. I have not analyzed that.
Maybe that hasn't really been analyzed, this idea of forgetfulness.
I don't think it has. I don't think it has. Because obviously I've been looking at ADHD for quite some time now, by 2 years, pretty relentlessly, and I have not come across that. That's something maybe we should do some research on.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that this idea that so many spiritual paths are about not having an ego, forgetting yourself, and so there definitely could be this element that there is that the ADHD may make that process of letting go, of emptying yourself of your personal, demands on the world, forgetting the harms and hurts from the past, So, and just that whole idea of mindfulness is about being present.
Yeah,
Of course, the famous book, The Power of Now. If you're living in the now, you're forgetting the past in that moment.
absolutely. I would say, yeah, I mean, the identity, right? I think so much of us try to run away from our identity, or we have shame behind certain things.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that getting just very honest with yourself around, the joy and,
Mm-hmm.
how you can look at things, and
Mm-hmm.
trying to, find the positives within yourself. And then just kind of trying to work on areas that, are more challenging. I think that's really, really important, is just trying to identify who you are, and, having self-confidence. I think is so important, because for ADHD, and I know this topic is entrepreneurship. So I guess to bring it back and to connect it, in entrepreneurship, it's very, very easy to get let down, right? And I think
Mm-hmm.
ADHD, right? Again, you're kind of this energizer bunny, and it's really about having self-confidence.
Mm-hmm.
That's,
Mm-hmm.
I would say that's kind of the daily puzzle, is kind of building yourself up, getting revved up. Um, but then also honing in on, the positive elements of
Mm-hmm.
who you are, and trying to write those down or journal those. And I'd say, from childhood ADHD to ADHD app, that
Mm-hmm.
kind of the topic, I would say a lot of that is finding your purpose, and
Mm-hmm.
trying to find, trying to identify why you're on this earth, right? Like, why you're here. And I think for
Mm-hmm.
me, it's to tell this story, and um, to try to hone in on, this different approach, and kind of to hyper focus on, I think medication is not the first resort. I think for
Mm-hmm.
some individuals, medication um, can be helpful, but I think it's important to hone in on that as more of a last resort than a first resort.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
that to me is really, really important. And a lot of
Mm-hmm.
this is within, right? And I guess that to get more spiritual, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's all this energy within you, and there are a lot of you have a lot of capabilities as humans, right? We're very complex
Mm-hmm.
systems, and there are these skills that we can develop, right? And a lot of this is work that you've done over, a long period of time, over 17 years as a clinical psychologist. And I guess bringing this to light is really, it can provide epiphanies for a lot of parents, and for a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people who don't think that some of these skills can become kind of part of their identity. And I believe that, and I know you believe that, and
Mm-hmm.
that to me was kind of that light bulb kind of aha moment. Um,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what's fascinating about purpose is, as you're talking, I'm thinking that, purpose may be one of the most powerful um, ways of managing ADHD, because when you look at the word attention, one of the synonyms is interest. And so if you're interested in something, that attentiveness means that you were already interested. And so if the idea there is, when kids are in school, they often don't even know why they're learning what they're learning. And they're not learning it in a way that really um, meets their developmental demands. That kids want to be physically active, kids want to have snacks all the time, kids want to talk, and so the kind of sitting in a desk and all these new, and these kind of being still and quiet and not talking. um, and so the idea here is that the more interesting something is, you naturally have attention, you don't have to try hard to focus. And so that as you find that thing, and so purpose to me would be like, 1,000 milligrams of interest. Meaning purpose is I think even more motivating and focusing and interesting than just something that is kind of a curious thing that you want to learn a little bit more about. And so we have these different levels of things that you have to learn because you're trying to get good grades, and then things that you're actually interested in, you might go study on your own, and something that just feels so purposeful. And how can you not pay attention when you have that sense of purpose? It's a driving force, and it's a focusing factor. And I think that also, to find a work that feels meaningful and purposeful is almost, again, a way of moderating the number one symptom of ADHD, which is, having difficulty paying attention. If you feel like you're contributing to the world and changing the world and on point and on purpose, then attention doesn't really become that much of, a deficit, actually.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think by improving a parent's mental health, give their children more of a chance to find their purpose, and not be treated like they're, not capable. Because the reactivity, right, from a parent can be debilitating, and it can be very debilitating for the child. So, this has so much to do with bonding health, because there is so much self-talk as is. So if you develop these skills, right, it goes back to this purpose. If you develop these skills as a parent to have empathy, to see things from a different perspective, to motivate your child, chances are they're going to dream big. They're going to have a lot of energy. So they're going to be very motivated to do something. And they're probably going to find out what they really like, potentially early on. And if you're a parent who is supportive, and sees the light, and sees their light, then chances are they're going to have that chance. Maybe it's not an entrepreneur, maybe it's something else, maybe it's a professional athlete, or it's a great chef, or or there's something else. But it gives the child a better chance. That to me is what I think we're trying to solve for. And I think it's really, really important. I think it's critical. And I think, again, what's being sold and what's being pushed and what's being prioritized is something different. And that's what gets me really excited, is putting this work out there and trying to promote it and trying to market it and trying to bring it to the masses, which is challenging, but it's fun. It's been fun to try to promote this, because there is this education gap, and I think I'm convinced, and I know you're convinced, that this is the answer. So we just need to get more people in our court, build the tribe.
Yeah, and as you're talking about it, that there was some research that showed that people who had self-compassion when they were procrastinating were more likely to get started. And it kind of makes sense that if you're beating yourself up or you're feeling like you're a failure, as soon as you have that self-compassion for yourself, it's kind of like you're saying, what, actually, this is hard. And but I'm willing to try. And then it builds their self-confidence once they have that self-compassion. And so that having this approach of compassion for yourself actually improves the symptoms. And so, and as you're saying, that self-compassion will come from the parent and child relationship, because of course, where do we learn from? We learn from how we're treated by others. And, so this idea of having parents to problem solve symptoms rather than to punish or blame, the blame, like, why can't you do this, versus, okay, this is really hard, you're procrastinating, but you know what, I just realized, maybe you feel like you don't have everything you need to finish, and you don't know exactly where to get started and you feel overwhelmed. Well, what's just the simplest step you need to do? Why don't we gather, all the tools that you need to get started on this assignment, and that's just our first step. So all of a sudden it's not like, oh, I have this huge project to do. It's just like, okay, here's a step, and then your motivation's higher, and then you procrastinate less. So I think, we're also talking about building the relationship through a problem solving approach, which means you look at it not as a willfulness or a defiance, but as really using strategies that help you to have compassion for the child, because no child wants to get in trouble. No child wants to not get started. And usually it comes back to exactly what you're saying, the self-confidence. You have to have some level of confidence before you're going to start something.
Absolutely. I'd say in closing, and I know you have a few other questions, but I guess one thing that I want to highlight just came to my mind that I think is really important, has a lot to do with my childhood, is I think it's really important to let your child know, like, it's okay, and to really hone in on the best system for them, the best educational system. It's really easy to get super competitive. And now that, we're really prioritizing mental health, and it's really important to prioritize mental health, the more competitive might not be the right environment for the child. And again, right, we know that there are a lot of professions that don't require getting incredible grades, and that might not be the right place for them. So art school or culinary school or other formats. And I think being open-minded to that, and, as a parent, right, you want your child to success has been measured historically by performance, right? And if we try to change that, and we try to, we add mental health in there, and your child being happy and opening that up, that really opens up the possibilities for, different, different formats, which I think is really interesting, right? You're seeing these different schools, obviously, controversial figure, Kanye West, launched the school. You have Steve Jobs' widow. Laurel Powell Jobs started a very cool school. You have all of these different, you have art schools, obviously, right? You have homeschooled different. So I think being open-minded to that as well, and saying, hey, what's going to create happiness for my child, I think should be the way of viewing things, versus, how are they going to be successful, right? And I think if you hone in on them being happy, chances are they'll be more successful as well.
Yeah, and actually, positive mood also increases focus and attention. So all of that is definitely true. So when we talk about an attention deficit, we also know there are many daily habits that increase attention and decrease attention. And so, of course, positive mood is one. There's this book called The Happiness Advantage that shows that positive mood increases every positive outcome in the workplace and in education. And so, that's kind of, happy families are our North Star, is one thing we've talked about in the past. And that's not just like, oh, isn't that sweet? It's also, yeah. And that's one of the prime drivers of attention and focus and motivation, is being happy.
Yeah, I would say, that there's a huge advantage now, right? When I was growing up, there weren't as many programs. I was definitely in a competitive school. My parents were trying to do everything they could to try to help, but there weren't these avenues. So I would say, as someone that likes to do research, there are a lot of more options now. So I would say that's a very positive thing. There are these newer programs, and there are these, different options. So
for example, Montessori schools are one where they cater to a child's need for physical activity. They have a lot of physical activity built into the day. They in many settings, they actually sit on the floor and do their homework so that they can move around. They're allowed to take breaks. And there's a lot of connection to nature. And many of them, they'll, work in gardens for part of the day. And there's some new models emerging around what's called academies. even at the middle school and high school level, where people can take classes, but with an emphasis in their interest, whether it be, health sciences or engineering or, other types of focus. Because if you think about it, if it feels like, oh, I want to go into healthcare, and somehow you're in this academy where you're learning all your required courses, but there's an emphasis on what you're actually interested in, all of those things we would expect to improve attention and success.
Absolutely. I know you had one or two final questions. Is there?
Yeah. How long are we going to go for?
So I think we've been going for 35 minutes.
Okay. And did we say we were going to be here for 30 minutes or more?
We did not, but maybe we end at 40 minutes.
Okay. Yeah. So, some of the other questions that I have to do with the increasing rates of ADHD. Mm-hmm. So as you know, we'll just say a little bit, when you were a child, how many other people did you know that had ADHD? How much were people talking about it? Every day you read the news, there's something about ADHD.
Yeah, it was very different. This was in the 90s. This was the early 90s. Mm-hmm. So in the early 90s, right? It was just emerging. It wasn't spoken about a lot. The emphasis was very different, and there was a really negative stigma. Mm-hmm. Stupidity was very related, to be honest. It was definitely, I would say that was definitely related. Oh, he has ADD, or he has ADHD. So there was definitely a negative. There was, obviously there has been a lot of advancements, right, around classifications of people. And at that time in the early 90s, that didn't really exist.
Mm-hmm. So it wasn't something that, and so as there's, really increasing rates of diagnosis. And what do you think are some of the societal causes or other causes? Parts of it has to do with awareness and shifting that stigma around it. What other things do you think have led to such increasing prevalence rates of ADHD?
Of course, social media.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Everyone's on social media. Mm-hmm. And everyone is looking for instant gratification. Many people are looking for instant gratification. I'm someone that tries to limit my social media uses for business. I try to limit it. And I would say that it's really, really dangerous. And I think there are some benefits to it, but there's so much minutia, and there is so much overstimulation that you become kind of obsessed. And I think that can create, symptoms of ADHD, right?
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
So those symptoms are pretty closely related. In the early 90s, when I was originally diagnosed, there wasn't text messaging, there wasn't social media, it didn't exist. Mm-hmm. So, I think the numbers, it's like 130% year over year in the adult ADHD space. And it's about over 25% in the childhood space. And it's mind-blowing. It's mind-blowing. But again, I think, you need to educate yourself, because, when you hear ADHD, even now, all you hear is, Ritalin, Vyvanse. When you talk about ADHD, the next word or the next sentence is medication.
Yeah. And, one of the things that, as you're talking about, with the increase, is when you were talking about the, social media, the one thing we know is that multitasking is diminishes attention, that it's as bad as, not getting sleep. And by the way, not getting sleep is huge risk factor for decreasing your attention. So again, cell phones, social media, even just the lighting are going to impair your sleep. But actually, if most people, how much often do they have their phone next to them, and they're doing one thing and they're kind of checking their phone, and they may have, alerts on, or they may be checking all of the time. Your brain is not designed to multitask in that way. And so you're literally diminishing your attention by multitasking. And even one study showed that just having your phone in the room with you diminishes your attention because it's somehow a magnetic pull, even if you're not on it.
100%.
Mm-hmm.
100%. I knew for a little bit I would leave my phone in another room. I don't do that now. I need to stop. I need to start doing that. Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, I am someone that I'm 34, so I would say that I'm kind of on the cusp. People that are now like in their 20s are, it is such a different population, even like 4 years younger than me. The amount, like the level of social media use is just is so much greater. Every year it's like so much greater. But for me, I am someone that is, I'm very rarely on social media versus, and I would say, like, if you were going to do an analysis of me versus others in the United States, I would say I'm definitely like super low. And even, even when I am on it at times, or you can become frantic, you're going through things, the behaviors. I mean, I've seen it so often where it's, you're flipping through things constantly, right? You're hyperactive, you're fidgeting, you're also nervous, right? A lot of people are posting 5 times a day, and you're going to get comments that you don't want from people that you don't know. It's not healthy. I think, obviously we saw the very marketed documentary, The Social Dilemma. Almost, I think millions of people saw that. If the creators of these platforms aren't allowing their children to use
their own kids,
chances are it's probably not the most healthy thing. They also have they've hired like behavioral scientists to create addiction, like to create addictive experiences. So they have, experts in digital systems, addictive digital systems, creating like, this is basically like it's a digital drug, right?
Exactly. It is. Absolutely. And also, there's research that, particularly in teens, that it's creating depression. And, that we know that it can create this depression because you can never live up to other people's, perfectly polished images. And it makes people feel less than, and it creates that anxiety and that depression. And so, the mental health crisis, there's data that suggests it goes hand in hand with social media and this effect of just never being able to be good enough. And, this kind of image of perfection. And so there is such a relationship to, smartphones and social media and having it ever present. And as we're saying, even multitasking is going to diminish attention. And so we're kind of pointing to this idea. There's a book called Stolen Focus that says that, we actually get it's not just that it's at times distracting, that we then become addicted to it. And that addiction preoccupies our attention. And so
I noticed that we actually had a comment. We had one question with a large, and I'm not an expert whatsoever in dyslexia.
Okay.
But the question was, with a large population of ADHD having dyslexia as well, is there a better understanding of which type of dyslexia, auditory, visual, or motor?
Well, so here in the San Francisco Bay Area at UCSF, there is a dyslexia center that has really done a lot of brain imaging about dyslexia. And, one of the conclusions that they've come up, and they've begun to become not just a dyslexia brain imaging, that they're really looking at all parts of the brains. And one of the things that they found is you can't really point to the brain and say there's dyslexia, let alone even the subtypes. So there's no place where you can say, oh, here's this area in the brain where you find dyslexia. And so there isn't a lot of precision around that in terms of, its relationship to ADHD. Although, some of the numbers say that about 30% of people with ADHD have dyslexia, but a larger percent of people that have dyslexia will have ADHD, just because dyslexia is a much lower prevalence. So in terms of the dyslexia, that there are, of course, a lot of accommodations that can be helpful with that. But again, as the more people are doing the brain imaging, what they're finding is that the brain is very, very interconnected. And it's getting harder and harder to say, oh, here's the part of the brain that has ADHD, or here's the part of the brain that has dyslexia. And so, I think that, mapping those onto each other, is kind of, a work in progress, but also in terms of, finding some clarity. More important to find the accommodations that work for you. Learning Ally is a business that has a lot of, textbooks and books and audio. Audio can be very helpful in reading. And there's some very specific specialists in dyslexia that can help to improve that process. I guess I should also say that I have worked with people that had probably the most severe dyslexia that you could imagine. But they were very, very successful adults. So I have seen many people with high levels of ADHD and high levels of dyslexia that were very successful. And in fact, in my book, The Gift of Adult ADHD, I interviewed Paul Orfalia, who had both dyslexia and ADHD, and he was the founder of Kinko's, which has now gone on to be acquired by FedEx for $2 billion. And I'll never forget when he said, I graduated 6th from the bottom of my graduating class, and I cannot for the life of me figure out what the 5 people below me were doing because I did nothing. And and so again, there's probably, the idea is that, we can't find a place and point to it and say, there it is in the brain, but that it also doesn't need to be something that means you cannot succeed in life. And so that's kind of the takeaway.
That was great. Okay, we just got a potential collaboration with Jay Williamson, Visionware RX. Okay, cool. I assume that's some sort of wearable. Interesting. Well, this was amazing. Is there any, I think you had a final question in terms of where I'd like to see Bonding Health, or where I see Bonding Health going.
Yeah. So, I'm just seeing the questions for the, with a large population of ADHD, since I'm just seeing this question for the first time, although you did say it out loud, with a large population of ADHD having dyslexia as well. And I think that is about 30%. Is there a better understanding of which type of dyslexia, auditory, visual, and motor? And I think, really what I would want to say about that as well is that, that finding the resources and the accommodations, and that to make it even more complicated, when you look at ADHD and you look at all of the different types of learning disorders, dyslexia is one type of learning disorder. But when you look at, all of the different categories, the overlap with ADHD and any learning disability is actually very, very high. I would say, like 80% of any person that has ADHD has some type of learning disorder. And of course, there's many different learning disorders. But so that again, it does kind of lead to this question of, what comes first? Like many people with dyslexia have ADHD, but a smaller percentage of people with ADHD have dyslexia, but many people with ADHD have some kind of learning disorder. But yeah, so that's good that I got to see that question, so I can expand on that a bit. But I also think that one of the bigger questions, we're really just getting started with Bonding Health, and some of the things that we do know that it's mission critical, that there is a mental health crisis. We do know that there's a shortage of providers. We do know that there's this missing link in ADHD treatment, which is the parent's emotional regulation. And very, very recently, and I'm even thinking this week, a study came out showing that dialectical behavior therapy was effective with ADHD. And dialectical behavior therapy is an emotional regulation intervention. And so underneath a lot of ADHD symptoms are emotional regulation issues. In fact, even looking at procrastination, why do people procrastinate? Usually an emotion is disrupting them, or lack of confidence. So the emotional regulation is really missing, and just newly, kind of finding some evidence that emotional regulation tools as a treatment are helpful. And so the idea there is that there are these other treatments that are emerging, but are not certainly distributed in terms of what we would call empirically supported treatments. And so what Bonding Health is doing is it's this paradigm shift. One, that emotional regulation is key, but two, the parent-child relationship is key, which means that we're also wanting to improve the parent's emotional regulation so that they can have a really strong bond, as in bonding health, with their child.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, and I know that the final question you wanted.
Oh, yeah. So the final question is, when we're really just getting started, but what is, as you imagine, the grandest vision for Bonding Health and what it could become and what impact it could have for families with ADHD?
Great question. Exciting question. So I think this can become a really large organic community of parents supporting parents, families supporting families, different symposiums, different conferences. And I think it really can become a very large organization that focuses on mental health and focuses on emotional health, especially with ADHD, because obviously these are fairly at-risk populations. So I see this as a very powerful brand that is holistic, that focuses on education around certain practices, certain alternative practices. Some of those being our exercises, right, and our our psychology driven interventions. Some of those being naturopathic solutions, acupuncture, meditation, different spiritual work, and then some of that being focused on teacher parent relationships. And I know we have Lisa on board now, who's been an elementary school teacher for 22 years, and a lot of her suggestions. So really building that community around experts who are taking this holistic approach to ADHD. And I think the way that we do that is really just outreach. And where I see this in 5 years, I see a very large following of individuals who have kind of woken up to this, I would say, plethora of resources, and Bonding Health can be that, that tool for them to really identify these different solutions. Because right now it's hard to kind of understand and see these different solutions. So to have workshops, to have different events like this, and to have places for parents to go when they're looking for help. That is really the vision, is to be that parent resource. So I see that as growing organically, and hopefully globally, right? So Europe, there's a huge population, 15 million plus parents who are dealing with this as well. So there's tens of millions of people who we can help to try to regulate their emotions, and by regulating their emotions and educating themselves on different best practices that are sustainable, that can hopefully really help the next generation of children who may be entrepreneurs, right, or who may be athletes. Help them do their profession better with mental health in mind. So that's the grandiose vision. Is this really, really large, expansive community?
I love it. Well, thank you so much, Penn, for sharing your personal story and making some connections and hopefully some inspiration for anybody out there. The thing that kind of hit me the hardest was when you said, maybe in the 90s, some people thought of ADHD as being stupid. And as you know, that's not true for you. It's not true for, others. And then just being able to really adopt a problem solving approach as we're doing and adding, this new paradigm shift towards better relationships, positive expectations for the child, and happy families, better moods, and that all of those things will help children to regulate themselves. And as we've been saying, emotional regulation is more and more being seen as some of the underlying aspects of these symptoms. So thank you so much, Penn.
Thank you so much. And everyone who is watching or will be watching, please go to bondinghealth.com and try our MVP product. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.